So now we're moving into the consumer side and how consumers will drive this workforce, because it's still always about workforce. So again, we have another amazing panel up here, and Tony Isabelli, who's the director of the State Energy Office at the Washington Department of Commerce, is our moderator extraordinaire for this panel. Tony's worked with WSU Energy Program, managed the energy efficiency section at WSU Energy Office, and was staff scientist focusing on energy efficiency and environmental issues at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in California. Tony was adjunct faculty member at Evergreen State, where he taught courses in energy, natural resources, and global climate change. Thank you, Tony. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate that. Is this microphone working? There we go. Yes, it is working now. So again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you for extending the invitation for me to be on this panel and have some very folks that I haven't interacted with before. I'm really looking forward to some of their remarks and comments, and I hope this is quite an interactive panel. This is particularly exciting to me for two reasons, because it's an intersection of two areas that I think are exciting. I work and run the Washington State Energy Office, which is in our Department of Commerce. So obviously have an interest in energy and all things around the development of clean energy and the type of things that folks have been talking about here today. But the other aspect, as the Department of Commerce, our main charge as an agency is to develop and encourage the development of jobs in the state of Washington. And so the intersection that we have here at this conference between energy and employment and good, high-paying jobs that are in demand, matching that with the skills and interests of a lot of the folks that are here today is quite exciting to me. So as Barbara said, this panel is on how consumers will drive the workforce, because as we know, as a market economy, it's the consumers that are going to make the ultimate decisions with their checkbooks. Or I guess here you don't even need a checkbook, right? You can just, the 15-day credit. But they'll make the decisions on what the demand is, and that's consumers, from all the way up to the large consumers, the utilities and the industries and so forth, down to the individual consumers. And I think today we have a panel with a very diverse range of experiences and knowledge around the consumer side and how that will influence the demand for the kinds of activities here and how that in turn translates into the demand for the workforce. And I'll defer the details of the biographies for our speakers since they are included in your program, and you can go back and take a look at those. And I'll just quickly introduce them, and we'll just work our way down as we decided alphabetically. John Allen, who is the president of the Grid Protection Alliance, will be our first speaker. John will be followed by Martha Rose, who's the owner of Martha Rose Construction. Kevin Schneider from the research engineer in the Energy and Environment Directorate over at the Pacific Northwest National Labs will provide his perspectives. And then Chris Stockner, the Energy Efficiency Coordinator from the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, OMSI, will be batting in the cleanup position here today for those of you who are baseball fans. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I've asked each of the panelists to spend a few minutes just addressing this general issue of consumer demand and their perspective on it. We have a couple of PowerPoint presentations, but I'm also hoping that this will be an opportunity for some significant interaction, questions, and perspectives from the audience as well. And so with that, John, I'll ask you to lead us off. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I always like the crowd just after lunch. Everybody is with it. So let me give you, this is my perspective on it. First of all, I am intensely interested in a lot of the work that we do is around new technology development and deployment. Number one, and number two, its application for a whole host of issues, including in this particular case, conservation, green energy, whatever it is you want to call it. Let me give you kind of a perspective as we lead into it. So most of the work that I do is US based, but we also do a lot of work in Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom and in Canada. And the interesting thing about that is that the profile is nearly identical with respect to the consumer market. And it's on that particular point I'd like to, I guess, give you some more of the details. So consumers, generally speaking, are considered the end users. And in the case of new technology deployment, they're only one of the two particular categories. The other category, of course, is the consumers within, in this case, an electric utility. And their ability, that particular constituency as a participant in any new technology development has always been, except for the organizations that have a direct responsibility, they're always sort of an afterthought. And again, that's a common theme, certainly worldwide in terms of these new developments. So I'm going to speak about the smart grid, and I guess the first thing, not to try to insult anybody here, but smart grid is kind of smart. In fact, there are those of us that would say that maybe in a lot of instances they're not. And grid, not so much, in as much as mostly it's about distribution systems and not the total energy delivery and certainly the generation part of it. That distinction, though, shouldn't really diminish the idea that we want to concentrate on advanced grid, because it turns out that the designs for what I will call advanced grids are already well underway, and I'm talking about 2 and 3 generations from now. That particular perspective becomes important because we probably have not yet seen what will drive utility consumers as well as end user consumers with respect to how they're going to interact with electric utilities and how they're going to actually decide what kind of electricity they want, how much of it, and their ability to make and take over more direct control. So, current state on this is, just let me make an observation, and this will apply to everyone in the room, whether you choose to admit to it or not, but your interaction with a power company is pretty limited. Other than paying the bill and turning on the lights on some sort of a regular basis, the interaction with respect to an electric company is usually through some sort of a customer support center, and unless you got a service problem, that's sort of the end of it. If you think about other technologies, that's the difference between 1900 and the year 2100. And it has a lot to do with what will actually have to be a fairly rapid evolution as these new technologies are deployed in the generation sector, in the transmission sector, and certainly as the smart grid and smart meters that are now being deployed, certainly in the US, are actually become smart. In fact, they become so smart you can't ignore them. It's sort of like having a 6-month-old versus a 16-year-old. One of them you take care of because you have to, the other one you take care of because you can't ignore them. If you do so, it's at your own risk. That's the same thing around technology. I know people get uncomfortable with that analogy, but I defy you to come up with a better one. So, current state, let's talk about smart grid deployment as it exists today in the US. So the issue is there's a fairly significant burst of activity around this starting in 2008, and a lot of it was driven by Department of Energy and other federal subsidies that were provided to advance the smart grid. And to say its deployment around the US is uneven is probably to be generous. And in a number of key deployments, certainly that I'm aware of, they're smart meters that are being used in very dumb ways. But they still do the job, like the lights are on, people get billed for things, and life goes on. There are other places where they've actually tried to deploy it in a pretty, I think, common sense and sophisticated way, only to be met by utter indifference on the end of by the end users, and in some cases, with a fair amount of hostility given the privacy issues. And by the way, the privacy issues in the UK and Australia are huge deals. In fact, it's really retarding the deployment of smart grid and smart meters because there is a real concern about what that information is going to be used for. Again, little do they know that you're worrying about the wrong thing, but nothing new about that. So let's then sort of take one step into the future and look at it. So the next generations are, I'm thinking now the next 2 and 3 generations that I'm certainly aware of. The way the generation sources interact with the transmission sources that interact with distribution are going to be remarkably different. I mean, the level of sophistication and flexibility that it offers to a power company to actually maintain the systems at even higher degrees of reliability and to recover and restore from events is probably on a scale we haven't really contemplated yet. This reliability and availability has a lot of obviously upsides in terms of cost of electricity to the end users or to the end customers. And somebody asked a question earlier about, well, does it make a difference with respect to residential versus commercial? And it does, it will. And again, the best thing I can point out to people that at the residential level, I think it will be a period of time before there will be a whole lot of interaction on their part. At the commercial level, at the industrial, at the people that own buildings, they're already at a level of sophistication that will allow them to actually take great advantage of that. So that has great value in terms of what making a particular system smarter in order to do really makes a lot of sense. So that's kind of the picture. Whether or not you decide to accept it or whether the premise with respect to the timeline makes any sense, that's what's coming. Literally, there are technologies that will be rolled out in 3 years that will allow transmission sources, as an example, to operate with the same capacity, with the same set of assets at 5 to 10% greater output, because we can now operate these systems much closer to their design limits. That's a big deal. You get more use out of it without spending any more money. However, and there's always a downside with the deployment of technology, events when they do occur will become breathtakingly complex to recover from. Which again, technology, if you believe these generation designs that people are looking at, will be made much simpler in that the logic will allow for the system to do its own thinking. And I'm old enough to now remember any time anybody told me the machine was smart enough to do something for itself, that I should sort of grab on and hold on, because there's always the law of unintended consequences writ large usually occurs from that. So what does that mean then with respect to the two different consumer classes I spoke about earlier? First of all, for the end user customers, the residential customers as an example, the way utilities interact with them are going to have to be done completely different. You're going to have to make your case about what the value is, because there's 30, 40, 50 years of research that'll tell you if your electric bill is of a certain amount, you ignore it. When it gets over a certain amount, you start to pay attention, especially about ways of mitigating it. And there's actually recent research that will actually support that. So if you as a utility want to be able to start taking advantage of it, you're going to have to make your case in a much different way than you ever have in the past to end users. The other point to be made is that rather than this sort of passive interaction that occurs right now between customers and utilities, the model will now start to look more like your interaction with Microsoft when you have a problem with Windows. Let's all sort of soak that in for a moment. Think about the utterances typically you have after 40 minutes of wait time. That is the very real likelihood of that occurring is there, because these systems are built by computer scientists and engineers that I know exactly what the hell it is this is supposed to do, but then whenever you pass it off to the sort of your mother or grandmother, if they can't figure it out, then it's technology that's almost entirely wasted. And that's going to be the challenge as we start to roll that out. The other part of it is, and this is sort of the generation that follows, they are a digitized generation that expects to do everything from a mobile app. My kids, that's the only way. None of them have a landline. All they ever have is cell phones. And by the way, they refuse to ever talk to me. It's always a text. So I don't know, maybe it's my voice. I've never really quite figured that out. But I'll continue to try to actually talk to them in person. Personal issue, sorry. But But that's the challenge we're going to have. So right now, their reaction is, can't I get an app for that? Isn't there something I can go and download from the Android store or from Apple that will allow me to manage my electric bill online? And there are a few examples of it, but the ones that I'm aware of are nearly worthless in terms of their utilization, but most power companies just simply don't do that. That's going to have to change. So there's a lot of work that will have to be done, and then obviously the kind of preparation you have both internally to a utility as well as the work that you have to do with customers is going to have to change pretty radically. So let's talk about the workforce itself. The thing that we have to have is, and I've been around long enough and I've gone through a number of different technology development and deployment. Training and how you prep the workforce is almost an afterthought. That model has worked reasonably well because the utilities generally held the actual content of the technology as closely held proprietary information. And they operated it that way, and so there was a certain amount of, as long as you don't know what's going on behind the curtain, or you don't know how the sausage is being made, it's okay. That situation will change pretty dramatically. So how you're going to be able to prep your workforce to work in this new environment is going to have to change pretty dramatically. And how you time training, the kind of people that within your organization that may never have had training is going to have to now have it. So again, think about the customer support personnel that you call and you train now to answer bills or questions about bills and about service interruptions, now being able to tell them how to fire up an app, connect it to the internet, and start to manipulate, for instance, how all of their electric appliances in a particular home is going to work, and do so in a way that it can't be hacked. My favorite story is I have a fellow that works for me that was able to hack a smart toaster. Now you say, a smart toaster, what the hell is that? Well, the Australians have smart toasters. He was able to get to the main customer support database through a toaster. So when we start to train people on how do we put all of these things together, you got to start to think about that as well, and that just adds another level of complexity. So kind of to wrap it up, there's this sort of passivity that exists currently, both in the utility customer base as well as the end user customer base. That model is probably will change, and it'll do so in a pretty rapid rate. And the benefit is, though, it's for all of the reasons that I guess we're here today, and that is there's a lot of extremely important value all the way from conservations to the use of renewables to really being able to have a much more direct interaction and control of how electric energy gets used. It's certainly well worthwhile. I would just suggest to you we have to think about it in a different framework. Thanks.
So thank you very much, John. I think you've gotten us off to an excellent start. You raised some very thoughtful and provocative points, and we'll move on now to Martha, who will give us some perspective, perhaps a little more from the construction industry, and I think we've got some slides for you.
I have, yes, I have just a couple slides, but so I'm a spec home builder, and I'm going to come at this from a slightly different point of view. My consumer is the home buyer, and the energy that we're trying to generate is actually the energy we're saving in the form of conservation. And so there's, actually I will put this slide on, if I can figure out how this thing works. This one. Okay, so this, we have found, I'll give you a tiny bit of history about my involvement with building homes that are close to net zero energy. In about 2003, I joined the Built Green program in the Seattle area that's part of the Master Builders put this program together. And then in about 2006, I joined on with Energy Star. Energy Star homes are 85% as efficient as, so they save 15% at least. And then 1 year later, in '07, I joined the Building America group, which is under the Department of Energy. And Building America is actually a bunch of builders across the country who sign on. It's less than 1% of all the builders, and we're part of a giant research project to figure out how to build new homes at close to net zero for about the same amount of money as a standard home would be built for. Maybe just a slight bit higher, but that would be offset by lower utility bills. And so, you know, this is my passion, this is what I do, but the consumers don't necessarily just come clamoring for these types of homes, and I do have to compete with my peers in the marketplace. So we've had to confront this curve of innovation. It's called the diffusion of innovation curve. It's been around for years, and when a new idea comes out, it takes a while for it to get adopted. The first 2.5% or so of the people that come on board, they're the ones that will adopt any new idea very quickly, like the first people that went out and bought the Priuses or the Leafs, the people that wait in line for hours to buy iPads. These are your early innovators. And then you have the next group, which are the early adopters, and they're the ones that, that's kind of where we are right now, I think, in this energy efficient homes category. I don't think we've hit the 34% mark. We're still around the 17 or 18% mark, where you still have to try very hard to get people to accept your idea. And then once you hit the early majority and then the late majority, you don't have to try so hard. It becomes so normal that people don't even talk about the thing anymore. It's like with cell phones or smartphones, pretty much the market's saturated now. Everybody has one, and the only ones that don't are the laggards, and they will never have one. And so at any rate, it's kind of exciting for me because I'm seeing that consumer demand is somewhere hitting about that 17, 18, maybe 20%, at least in the Seattle area. And that's something that is very good because new homes that are energy efficient are the low-hanging fruit of energy conservation. And most people know this statistic, but buildings and homes consume probably about 40 to 45% of all our energy. So if we can succeed in making it so you don't have a utility bill, that's really an ideal. Or if your utility bill is so low it's inconsequential, then that's really great. So then the question is, well, how do you get people over that hump and where they want to start jumping on this bandwagon? And so the very first Built Green conference that I went to, I had the same mindset that every other builder that I've talked to has, which is, I'm not going to build this way because nobody's asking for it. And there was a woman from Florida there. She was a realtor, and Florida, surprisingly, had a very strong Built Green program at the time. And she stood up there and she said, back in the 1940s, did people go to the store and ask for this little black box that had people inside of it talking to them? And the answer is no, but was a TV a success or a failure? It was a success. And it wasn't a success because manufacturers waited for the consumers to come and ask for it. It was a success because they marketed it and showed people what a great thing it was. And once I heard that, I realized that I was in, and I was solidly in, but then it became the challenge as to how to sell the idea, and that is an incredible effort when you're in that first 2.5%, which we were. And so basically, after a lot of fumbling around, finally figured out what some of the steps are to get more integration of the consumers into our product. And that is some of it's old-fashioned advertising, but really mostly our tools that are available today are things like social marketing. That's a big one, and it's one that I didn't fully appreciate until I found a really good realtor who got me 400 friends and started blogging and started making it so that if you do a Google search of my company, it comes up really fast with a whole bunch of entries, and so we're trying to reach people that way. And I think almost every advertising company in the world now uses similar techniques. So when, in addition to that, we do on-site classes, we do off-site classes, we do everything we can to educate people. I will say that for the first time in January, I probably had a sale to somebody who bought one of our houses not because they cared about energy efficiency, but just because they liked the house. And then when they learned about the energy efficiency, that made them like it even more. But to me, that's the magic moment, is when your product is appealing to across the board to everybody, no matter whether they're caring about energy efficiency or not. So, and then how does this tie to green jobs? Well, every single project we've built in the last 10 years, we've employed green workers or they're green jobs. And so I've been telling all of the workers, no matter what they do, whether it's the excavator or the electrician or the plumber, all of them are green jobs. And so I just think people need to think really broadly about this, because green jobs in the construction world are attitude-based more than anything. It means that the excavator is thinking about how we're removing things off the site, what we can save, and we're segregating materials and deconstructing, recycling, and even like plumbers have to think differently about how they're distributing the hot water. All of these things matter. And when you get into the finer points of really assertive approaching net zero homes, such as in Passive House, I was able to take that class a few summers ago, and where you're looking at even the lineal feet and the diameter of the pipe from the hot water tank to each fixture. So across the board, in my world, any job that's out there has a green component to it, and as long as the people doing the job have the mindset to be thinking about how can the end result of my work result in more energy efficiency, then it qualifies as a green job. Could even be just recycling on the job. So I'm not going to talk any more about this. I'm hoping that there'll be some more conversation about it in the question and answer period. So in a nutshell, that's my story, okay? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martha. So now we've picked up the perspective of the construction side, and right down to the houses that we're living in. We'll turn to our next speaker from Pacific Northwest National Lab, Kevin Snyder, and he'll continue on for us. So, Kevin?
Is that working okay? Sounds like it. Okay, can we go back to the title slide for this presentation? So how customers will drive the workforce. I think this is a really interesting topic given the location that we are here today. I'd like to step back a little bit further in history, primarily because of the work that we're doing for Centralia Community College right now is looking at the development of history in the Northwest, or rather the development of electricity in the Northwest. Because if you look through the history of electricity development from the 1880s in this region, you'll see that it's been intimately tied with customers and the end users. Now, the comment was made earlier that as customers, we generally don't interact with the utility, and I would say that's absolutely true on a day-to-day basis, but I think we do on the decade basis. And this has some real implications for how the system is run. If you look at the original electric loads that were first started back in the 1880s, they were primarily electric lights, carbon arc, and then later on incandescent lights. This worked well for customers. They didn't know what they wanted yet, so that seemed to work. But from a utility's perspective, the problem was the load only existed at night. So this goes back to what was said earlier today by Wanda, where the problem is that we have these very peaky systems with low utilization factors. This was a perfect example of that. There was no load during the day, but there was a lot of load at night. So what utilities did is they started to switch streetcars to electric streetcars. They started to level out their load factor a little bit, so you had some load during the day as well. This was still during the time when, as I said, customers didn't know what they want, so the industry was kind of feeding them what they needed. Another example of this was also with the early electrification of factories. They didn't really know what could be done with electric motors yet, and so industry had to kind of feed them what they needed. Well, once people started to like these new technologies, whether it be streetcars to get to your new neighborhoods in the suburbs or new factory motors, there started to be a much larger demand for it. And then we started to see this load peak start to invert itself, where we started to see more load during the day. An interesting thing that during this time period, you had the same problem we had today. There weren't enough trained people to perform this work. So one of the reasons it took so long for factories to industrialize with electricity was that there weren't enough trained, what they called engineers at the time. These are the people who would actually build and maintain the motors. There weren't enough of them. So this was a case where the workforce was being the limiting factor for the consumers. As you move forward with time, once again I said we're talking about on the period of decades, people became more and more used to these new appliances, especially at the residential level. Once utilities gave away free irons and other type of appliances, we became entitled and we wanted more and more of these, and we started to drive the load peak higher and higher. This was really the shift where the customers started to set the pace for what utilities really had to deliver. And here I'm talking about customers in the sense of residential customers. And earlier I'd mentioned about this facility. This facility was another great example of where customers and industry weren't really in sync. This facility was one of 2 nuclear power plants that was designed and developed by the WPPSS back in the 70s. The idea being that through the 60s and 50s there had been strong load growth of about 7% in the Northwest. Everyone thought that was going to continue. And so in order to prepare for that, they started to build these new plants. But what we saw was that the load growth, for a number of reasons, wasn't as robust as expected, and so there was no need for these plants. This caused a number of problems, but the one that most directly impacts us here is that a lot of power programs started to go away, a lot of interest in power engineering went away. And so throughout the 80s and even into the early 90s, we lost a lot of our power engineers. And this was an example where your customers, because of their choices, are directly impacting what we see in the workforce. In this case, not enough people. Now, we've seen that there's been a renewed interest in this field of study, as well as in the university, colleges, and technical schools. And so now when you look at how the customers drive the workforce, we have to say, what do we mean by customers? There are a number of different customer segments. You can have residential customers, which most of us here are familiar with, but you can also have commercial, industrial, agricultural. There's a wide variety. Cross-cut this, different types of technologies. You have the technologies. Once again, smart grid's been talked about in a lot of different ways. I'm going to break it into 2 areas: the technologies that customers are aware of and those that they're not aware of. And so if you overlap this with, we'll call the residential and the commercial industrial, you kind of have 4 different segments. And each of these is going to drive the workforce in a slightly different way. So when you look at the first customer type, residential, these are customers that really can't move anywhere else. They're not going to move to a new area to get a different flavor of power or a different level of service. Whereas commercial and industrial customers, they can make that choice. For instance, Google has started putting server farms on the east side of the mountains to get access to low-cost hydroelectric power. For publicity reasons, it looks good for them to be tapping into low-emission power as well as having low rates. So that's an example of a utility that will move based on the level of service that they can obtain from a utility. Now, in order for utilities to deliver that type of service, it has to not only be low cost, but also reliable and efficient. And so that will definitely adjust the type of workforce that you hire. In order to do that with these higher capacity factors and these peakier loads, you have to hire people that are able to deploy these new technologies, whether they be distribution automation through reclosers and volt var optimization, or new renewable sources of generation. At the residential level, while the people may be fixed, there is the possibility to start engaging people over time. It was mentioned that these concepts of demand response at the household level, they are not finding widespread adoption rapidly, and there are a number of factors for that. This is a case of people have become used to very low-cost power that's very reliable, and we don't want to pay any more for anything else because we're getting pretty much what we want now. So now we're kind of going back to 100 years ago where industry kind of has to lead them to where they're going. And there's a lot of good technical reasons why we want to do that, and the number one reason is this low utilization factor, or this peaky power system. It costs us a lot to be supplying this very high peak and then have the rest of the system off peak. So if we can start to lower that a little bit, it has a very substantial benefit to society as well as to individual people. Now, going back to the fact that people don't want to be disturbed by the inconvenience of dealing with their power company, what this means is we're going to have more automation in these systems if they're going to work in an effective way. They have to be automated so that the customer can feel engaged, but at the same time not be bothered on a routine basis. And so this is going to require a workforce that understands far more technically complicated systems. Now it's going to be overlaid with IT as well as human factors, how to interact. And there's a lot of other complications that arise because of the inelasticity of power customers. So as you look through these over time, you'll see that some of the problems are replicating themselves, and we're kind of in a new phase of something that we have seen in the past, although it does look a little bit different now, and that as you look across the different range of technologies and the various customers, depending on how you define them, that each of those 4 areas I discussed is going to have a significant impact on the workforce. In order to really see these benefits of lowering the peak and having a more efficient system, this is where we'll need to start making sure that utilities have the people that they need to engage in each of those areas. And it's not an easy thing to do. Once again, going back to the conversations that were said earlier about everyone coming out of these siloed programs in universities and community colleges, there's a lot of truth to that. But unfortunately, the solutions to these problems are multidisciplinary. And so we have to have people that can reach across all of those silos to some level. Now, you don't have to have people that are world-renowned experts in every single area, but you have to at least understand the consequences of your touch points with those other areas and make sure that what you're doing is relevant. So I think I will leave it with that.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I particularly appreciate you providing some historical perspective here and recognizing that many of the issues and the opportunities that we're dealing with today have been around perhaps in different forms, but may not be that different overall than they have been in the past. There may be some lessons there. Our final speaker, Chris Stockner with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, will give us a little bit on some of the things that you're doing, I think related mostly to public education around energy and the environment. So, Chris?
Great. Thank you. I guess I'll stand up, but I will ask everybody not to look too closely at my shoes. So it's kind of counting on the tablecloth there. I won't go too far into the reasons why I'm not wearing the shoes I intended to today, but they involve one of my daughters who's 2, mud from the garden, and yeah. So, thanks everybody for having me here. As Tony mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we're working on at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. We're OMSI to everybody who knows us. So if you're from anywhere, probably in the south half of Washington as well as Oregon, you know us as OMSI. So I'm from the museum world. Informal science education is what we refer to, how we refer to what we do. ISE, one of the parallels between the museum world and the utility industry is we have a lot of acronyms. We're versed in acronyms too. So, informal science education, and honestly, a lot of what we're focusing on right now is energy and the environment. That's the big initiative that we have underway right now. So we're looking at helping people learn about energy, helping people understand the science and the issues behind the electrical grid as a major focus for us. And we see a lot of relevance in that right now. We've found there's issues in the news right now with overgeneration of power in the Columbia River Gorge. In Oregon right now we have a draft 10-year energy plan that talks about meeting all of our new power demand through efficiency. That's just an idea that's out there right now from the governor's office, but it's kind of driving news coverage and talking more about energy efficiency. We have a lot of interest in renewable power down there from sort of the consumer side, but what we find, as you guys find as well, is that there's not a lot of understanding about some of the issues that underlie all of that. So when we think about how OMSI fits into that and what we want to do, we want to help people understand the issues and things, but a lot of what we see our role as informal educators is kind of inspiring people to be interested in that, and in particular, inspiring young people to be interested in learning more about that. So it was something that was talked about a lot this morning, outreach to K through 12 students and kind of getting people engaged and thinking more about that. I really like the slide that Wanda showed this morning that had the little girl and she had the thought bubble coming out and she was thinking about the electrical grid a little bit. That's success for OMSI. That's what we try to do. You know, if we can get kids thinking a little bit about that, their parents too, get families engaged and thinking about that and being interested in learning a little bit more about it, we provide sort of a succession of experiences to engage people, and then we hope that they'll go on and learn more about those types of issues as well. So energy and environment at OMSI, this is a picture of a solar electric charging station that we dedicated a couple of years ago with a lot of support from Portland General Electric, one of the big utilities down in our area. Just a little bit about OMSI and sort of what we do. Our targets, our family audiences primarily. We work a lot with young people. We work with school groups. We have field trips coming into the museum pretty frequently. We also have an increasing number of programs that are targeted at adults. And one of the things you find working in informal education is you don't change the level of the content that much when you're targeting adults versus you're targeting kids and families and things. A lot of things we develop, we sort of target at 6th graders, and no matter who the target audience might be, that's the level of the science content where we're trying to engage people with, because we tackle subjects that kind of run the gamut. We have about 1 million visitors a year come through our museum, about 90,000 students per year on field trips, and then we reach quite a few more people through outreach programs, which are throughout Oregon, but also throughout the Pacific Northwest. So we have a pretty broad range, pretty broad reach. That way. Energy and environment, just a little bit about where we're focused and how we're trying to work in this way. We're trying to become really a premier public education resource for people in the Northwest to learn more about energy, renewable energy in particular, issues like climate change, and then sustainability more broadly. So understanding science behind the issues and catalyzing action. As much as possible, we want people to be walking away with something they can do or a way that they know to go and learn more about something so they can do something, make some kind of change. And then really showcasing the work of partners is a big focus for all of that work. And in particular with one of the projects I want to talk a little bit more about. So we see all of that as our focus. We develop those goals based off of interests in Oregon and in the populations that we serve. We see that reflected there. There's a lot of interest in sustainability and sustainable energy, as well as nationally, trends in looking at the smart grid, looking at energy efficiency, looking at the work that's happening to try to advance renewables. All of that is kind of taken into account, and that's how we came to develop these goals. Again, our role, we see it as kind of inspiring interest in those areas, helping the public learn a little bit more about some of these issues which are pretty complicated and which a lot of times they just get a really thin slice of through the media. So you may see something in the news about overgeneration in the Columbia River Gorge, but when you read an article in the Oregonian or you see a 30-second spot on TV about that, you're not going to get any kind of understanding of the issues around the electrical grid. Why is Bonneville having to turn off wind generators? Why? What are the problems there? What are all the trade-offs? What are all the issues involved in that? So trying to help people learn more about that, and also inspiring people, young people in particular, to be interested in learning more about those subjects. A lot of our role, we see it as, when we look at the kind of workforce and where we stand in that the sort of pipeline, getting people inspired and interested in making those types of subjects fun and engaging, and then hopefully, again, having students go and want to learn more through more in-depth programs that we offer as well as that other people offer. So. A little bit more about strategic goals. Just the one in red here I wanted to highlight because we really are trying to work with industry, work with academic researchers as well, and kind of bring some of that content to the public as an increasing part of our focus, and it's really relevant to all of this stuff. And understanding science behind issues and innovations, which when you think about things like smart grid in particular, it's a huge area of innovation. I don't think the public really has any idea what kind of impacts it can have in terms of sustainability, in terms of how it can change just their everyday at-home use of electricity. There's a lot of things there that I think are unexplored and are just kind of starting to see the tip of the iceberg in terms of having people think about those things. I'm going to skip this, is kind of repetitive, but energy and environment OMSI, basically the content we're talking about, as I already mentioned, it's sustainability, broadly considered, sustainable choices, renewable energy is a big focus, and then earth and environmental science is a part of it as well. So Well, a big project we're working on right now is an exhibit called Renewable Energy. It's going to be a permanent exhibit at OMSI. And it's one of the ones that we've built a lot of really great partnerships around. We've worked closely with Portland General Electric, which is a major utility down in our area, which probably everybody here is familiar with. We've also worked with a number of renewable energy companies. We've worked with Bonneville Power Administration, all as partners in developing this. And starting to tackle a little bit of the technology behind renewable energy sources, but also understanding some of those trade-offs and those things, those bigger issues that underlie renewables as well as other types of power. And just a little bit of our front-end audience research, as we call it, things that we went out and talked to our visitors in the museum about, asking them questions, what they already know about a subject, trying to look at what the gaps are, as well as, what should we be focusing on here. And I won't walk through too many details here. We talked about, knowledge of renewable energy sources, and we found a lot of people are aware of what renewable energy sources are. They know, the solar power is a renewable source. They have a pretty good working definition of that. Where does your electricity come from? I didn't put up the entire slide with the answers we got to this question, but something like 12% of people said the wall, literally, like, the outlets. So when you throw that question out there as an open-ended thing, you really start to realize how little understanding and awareness there is about power sources. And forget about the electrical grid. I mean, when you think about that, I think that's just an abstract concept to people or one they're not familiar with at all. So when we started this project, we were really interested in focusing on smart grid technology, and it's still going to be in there at some form, but we realized we need to just cross out the smart and focus on grid when we're thinking about trade-offs around different energy sources. And then what would you most like to learn about? And this is, again, where that kind of consumer side really comes in, because people were very interested in learning about energy efficiency. They were interested in learning about things that it can do, things that can be active, things that can make that relationship with their utility a little bit more interactive and dynamic. And I know PGE down in our area is really interested in that too. They're kind of looking at the future of being a broker of electricity and having electricity flowing in different directions and things. So we found a lot of people interested in those types of action steps they could take, even though they don't have a lot of knowledge about how that can actually happen. So this exhibit, which is just one of many projects underway at OMSI, but I'm not going to go into any of the other ones right now, it will focus on renewable energy technologies and sustainability, how you can think about the energy that you use. But really, like underlie the different issues, the trade-offs that underlie different energy sources is a major focus for us. And just a couple of the exhibits that we're specifically working on in this. Wind energy is one of them. And a lot of these different components we're working on during the lunch speakers, I think is it Volt Lab, I hope is the sponsoring company. And you saw that person talking about some of the equipment that they manufacture and put out there for college students. You could think of this exhibit we're building as Volt Lab equipment for fourth graders who are not supervised. Basically, that's what we're building as we build this. So it's all interactive, it's very engaging, it's all meant to be indestructible because it goes in our hands-on science museum. But we do have a control-a-turbine activity we're building, which we've worked with Vestas to create, and it basically lets people try out the things that computers generally do to control an individual wind turbine and try to maximize the power generation. We have a wave energy area, since that's a focus in Oregon in particular for the future. There's a lot of startup companies working on wave energy technology. And then we have, in particular, an area called the Energy Center. And this one is where we're really trying to bring all this together. And the keystone activity here is going to be kind of an interactive, manage the electrical grid activity. It's going to talk a little bit about demand response and smart grid technology, but mostly it's going to be just getting people to start thinking about changing demand and how utilities have to work to meet that, what is involved in that, or people like Bonneville Power when they're regulating and running the system. What types of factors do they have to be taking into account? They have to be looking at wind generation, seasonal changes in demand, as well as supply and all of that, and really just kind of getting people started thinking about that. And of course, it's OMSI, so we're going to try to make that fun. It's a game. You can brown out your city, you can black out your city, you get some fun feedback from that. But just something to kind of get people started thinking about that. So with that, basically, I'm going to leave off there, and hopefully we'll have some good questions and things. And again, this is yet another perspective of the other people on the panel, but hopefully it's a good, diverse set of those.
Thank you very much, Chris. So take an opportunity here for some questions and so forth from the audience. But I guess I want to raise one first question here, and that is, I think many of you spoke about economics in here, but I'd be a little bit, I want to probe that just a little bit, because we certainly, when we think about energy, we think about energy costs and paying for it, because what's the big energy cost indicator that we see every day, of course, and that's the price of gasoline. As you drive down the road, you see those signs all the time, and with our prices having gone up recently, I know from the number of complaint calls that we've received at the state of Washington that people are very conscious about that. But you also talked about innovation and a number of other factors. I guess I'd ask you, anyone on the panel here, to talk a little bit about how does economics play into all of this in terms of consumer demand? What's important in that regard?
I'd like to start by turning it on. Is that on? Okay.
Yeah.
The one thing that I think makes electricity really kind of challenging is that we basically expect it to operate as a service, but we buy it as a commodity. So basically, we expect it to be on whenever we want it, but at the end of the day, we only expect to get billed for X number of units of power, kilowatt hours. And this is what's led to that whole high or low utilization factor system with a peak in it. And so that's made it very challenging because there's no incentive for the customers to move it to the off-peak times. And that's where these concepts of demand response come in, where if you could have a tiered price so that there is some incentive to move to the other times of the day, that would lower the cost of the system. Now, kind of the chicken and egg problem that you run into is that in order to finance these new systems, that has to get rolled into the rate and it gets passed on to the customer. So, when you're initially trying to sell this to the customer, what you're saying is, we're going to change the way you use power and you're going to pay a little bit for it up front, but you'll save money in the long run. And so trying to get that message across makes it very challenging. I think that's been one of the biggest efforts so far, and that goes back to this need for automation.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I got a different perspective on this. There are at least 50 regulatory agencies in the U.S. that determines the cost of electricity. I'm less convinced that it's an individual end user or customer that's going to determine price. It's a regulatory body. And the regulatory body has a whole bunch of other things that they have to take into account. And the price of electricity is a number one issue, especially if you're in a particular region where economic development is a really big deal. So what is available to a commercial customer has a regulatory consideration versus a residential. Now, 30 years ago, residential subsidized commercial. The situation now is completely reversed because commercial enterprises can go off grid and develop bilateral agreements that can bypass all of that. So that's one. Two, the role electricity plays certainly in the U.S. marketplace has also changed. So since the first two oil shocks in the 70s and in the 80s, there was a concerted effort in the U.S. to convert to electricity where you could. That's the good news. The bad news is we're now utterly reliant upon electricity. You can't go to an ATM. You can't even flush toilets. You can't get into hotel rooms. In some instances, you can't even get into your own house. You can't do anything. You can't make water clean. You can't process wastewater without electricity. It is the singular item that is required for all of those. The regulatory view of that has changed dramatically as a result. It's now almost like, well, first of all, it's almost entirely, except at the generation level, it's a monopoly. And it's a monopoly where commoditization is the best way of putting it, but it's a commoditization unique in that it's produced instantaneously to its use. Try to think about that. There is no other endeavor that we have that is the actual profile. You can always store and be able to use, manage peaks and valleys, but now you have to develop a system that costs vast amounts of money. Anything an electric utility does is a big deal from an economic standpoint, and that all has to be factored in. Regulatory agencies, no matter where they are, if green energy is a big component of it, they cannot ignore the cost of electricity on a per unit basis because it is viewed as a commodity. And if you're in the southeast part of the United States and your cost of electricity goes over 10 cents a kilowatt hour, somebody's not going to get elected next time. In the state of Washington, I'm not even sure what it was, what it is now, but when I lived here, it was like 3 cents. If it went to 6 cents, in fact, somebody did get reelected. So you can't ignore all of that. Economics is the driving factor around a lot of this innovation. And it's one of the reasons why if you're an electric utility executive, do you want to spend $500 million for a 1.5 million customer deployment of smart grid? The short answer is, unless you make me, probably I'm not going to do it, because that could be a career-ending decision on a lot of people's part if I can't figure out a way to recover it in rates.
Thank you, John. Martha?
I have a small comment to add to this discussion. In 2008, when the housing market was in a nosedive, we were able to sell 4 energy-efficient homes that use only 30% as much energy as other new homes. That was because gas was over $4.50 a gallon at that point. We saw a direct correlation between that. So, and our norm for energy efficiency is that 30%. So if we can build homes that are only use 30% as much electricity, and we can do it and sell it for the same price as a non-energy efficient home, we are seeing that market turning, so people are responding to that. And the way that we keep them exactly the same price is by reducing the square footage just a little bit, without same features inside the home, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, 2.5 baths, or whatever, but just take some square footage away to balance the equation out so that the price is the same. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there because a lot of times people are talking about more sophisticated ways to save energy, but the least sophisticated way, adding lots of insulation, I feel like is very, very effective.
Thank you. Chris, anything you want to add?
I guess I'll just add that in OMSI and thinking about programs and exhibits and things, we really have tried to incorporate like the triple bottom line idea, we call it, where you're thinking about the environment, you're thinking about financial bottom line, as well as the community, the social piece, and that's something we really have found resonates well with people. So you think about energy efficiency and looking at the amount of money people are going to save. That's a good message to have, and it seems like that's something that really, a lot of people start from that. So when we think about helping the environment, if you can also show, there's the other benefits, maybe you're going to improve air quality in some area of the state, or you're going to also be saving money, as well as helping the environment. We really find that kind of adds to that message.
Chris. Let's go ahead and go to the audience. I think we've got a microphone here, so if you'd raise your hand, and if you'd please stand up and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Jim Malinowski. I teach power utilities technology at Clark College down in Vancouver. My question is primarily for Chris. We know that corn-based ethanol is a net loser. What can you do to educate the public about the net life cycle energy balance of various alternatives, like how much energy goes into producing a windmill and maintaining it versus the energy output? How much energy goes into producing solar cells versus their life cycle production? Are you trying to develop that kind of information for the public?
The short answer is yes. In the same sense, we're developing the other content. So everything's at a pretty high level with us, and we haven't talked about ethanol specifically because with a lot of our exhibits and programs, we really have a regional focus. So we're looking at either energy sources that are being developed here pretty actively, or things that we think are likely to be developed in the future. But we're trying to get people to think about trade-offs around all of these different energy sources. So if you think about fossil fuels and you're thinking about the environmental impact, the carbon, well, that's one thing, but what are the costs associated with wind energy? Are there environmental costs? Are there costs to communities where the windmills are sited? We're trying to get people to think about that whole range of issues. So as we all are trying to promote, renewable energy, we're trying to say, look, this is a great source of energy for the future, but there's a lot of things that have to be thought about here. And when people ask, well, why can't we just build enough windmills to power the entire country or the entire state? Well, there's a lot of issues with that. Understanding a little bit about the electrical grid is an important part of that. Understanding all of the different costs and benefits, I think, are important parts of that. And we've tried to capture that with all the exhibits and programs at a high level.
Another question in the back there.
Hi, I'm Jalene McKinstry with Gonzaga University, and I want to say kudos for doing the work to explain to kids about the energy grid. And we've really struggled in our program. We're a master's degree in T&D engineering, and trying to figure out how to relate that into middle school kids is really, really tough. And it just struck me that we actually ended up using the LabVolt kit upstairs. They have a green tech kit that has a solar panel and a little hydrogen fuel cell car and a windmill. And in your books, you'll see a picture of a little Girl Scout, and she's got a fan and a windmill, and she's all excited. That's what we use to go out and, talk to kids in the schools. So we actually have our students trained to run those labs and go to activities and do it. And it struck me that some of you might be in the same place we are. Well, it sounds great to go out and do outreach, but what the heck does that look like? I'm teaching college students. So anyhow, there are resources out there, and those kits are wonderful. So that's just an option.
Thank you for those comments. I think we had another question up here in the front. Is there somebody? Yeah. They're bringing the mic.
Hi. Nationally, the media and our culture is polarized and split on climate science. How do you address it to get the message across? Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris. Yes.
I thought it was, but I just wanted to that's a great question, and that's something we found to be somewhat controversial, and that's, it's an issue that we don't try to avoid it, but we do try to be respectful of different people's opinions and things. I mean, as a museum, we look at issues that are really science-based issues, in our opinion. Evolution is another one that is it's a trigger for some people. It raises emotions and things, but we try to think of ourselves as we're presenting the best science about any given issue. And when you think about climate change, the best science, the prevailing mainstream science, I think, is pretty clear. So that's primarily what we focus on. We definitely acknowledge, one of the things we always try to get across, and again, at a fairly high level, is science is its own enterprise, and there's, disagreement is part of the nature of it. Basically, if evidence comes up that shows people should be thinking something different, well, that's part of the process of science, so we focus on that. But when we think about climate change and things, we primarily say, this is the prevailing viewpoint held by the majority of scientists. That's what we're focusing on. There's lots of, subtle pieces within that. There's dissenting views, but this is what most people agree is happening.
So, Barbara, I'll check with you. I think we're up to our time. I'm wondering if you mind if we go over for about 5 minutes. Would that be okay? Other questions? No more questions? There we go. Yes.
Thank you. Larry Owens, Shoreline Community College and solar advocate. And the previous administration in Washington at one point tried to have Bonneville's electric rates be lifted so that we don't have low subsidized costs here and it would go to market rate. That idea apparently was squashed by Western governors, but do you foresee that coming back on the table? And if so, what impact do you think it would have on this whole topic of energy and construction, the grid? And as a solar advocate, if I only wore that hat, it'd be fantastic. But what's your thoughts on that?
I don't really want to guess about what the governors may or may not do and what the government policy is. But one thing I will say is you're right, that as prices go up, other technologies become a lot more viable. We're currently working on a project out on Maui where residential rates are 45 cents a kilowatt hour. Solar out there, basically no matter how you do it, it's cost effective. So if rates were to go up in this region for whatever reason, that would be beneficial for certain technologies. There would be an impact on the construction sector, and there's a lot of negative impacts to it, but there are some beneficial aspects to that. Not that I'm personally advocating for higher power rates, but...
No governor will either. Yes.
Hang on for there, Jeff, for the microphone.
I'm going to try to answer that last question a little bit. I used to work for the U.S. Senate Energy Committee in Washington, D.C. When Scoop Jackson was chairman, and I was kind of charged with addressing that issue to the Northwest, and it's something that's been continuing ever since, frankly. And it really wasn't the governors, well, the governors opposed it, true, you're right, but it was the Northwest Congressional Delegation that is one thing that, probably the only thing the Northwest Congressional Delegation has been able to agree on consistently is the need to protect low-cost power in the Northwest. Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. Everybody gets together on that. Interestingly enough, there was a group called the Northeast Midwest Coalition. It's those states, Northeast Midwest states, 62 senators from those states, pretty powerful bloc. They've tried for years and years and years to force Bonneville and the other power market administrations to charge market-based rates. One of the things they've tried to do is get the environmental community in the Northwest to back that for various reasons, actually tribes as well. So far, they have been unsuccessful. I don't think environmentalists, as a general rule, really want to be charged with being responsible for doubling the rates in the Northwest. But it's been a longstanding issue. Frankly, I mean, the Obama administration is the first administration to not try that. Even the Clinton administration tried once. And frankly, it'll probably depend on if Obama stays on as president or if we get a certain governor former governor from Massachusetts as president. OMB is always ready to try that. And they have support not from those other states. Why? Because they don't like the fact that our goods and services are cheaper here in the Northwest than they are in other parts of the country.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't ask one other question of this panel, and I'll give you an opportunity. We'll go ahead and get to the break and I'll give you an opportunity to come up, because I think the panelists will be around for a while, certainly during the break, if you have specific other questions or comments. And that is one of the big emerging technologies in the electricity side, and that's electric vehicles. There's certainly a big push here in the Pacific Northwest for the adoption of electric vehicles. We're one of the major test beds for that. I think Washington has the second highest adoption rate of electric vehicles in the United States, second only to San Francisco and the California area. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. How does that fit in from the consumer perspective? Is there something there? Is that something we should be thinking about? Or is that a technology that may not come to fruition? So anyone who wants to?
Sure, I got an opinion about it.
All right. Well, let's get John here.
Here's my opinion. All of the plug-in electric vehicle factories in the world now are all shut down. Why are they shut down? They're not selling electric vehicles. I'm not passing a judgment on whether or not the technology has value. It probably does. But the consumer speaks to this issue, and even with, I think in the UK it's 10,000 pound subsidies, in the US it's $7,000 subsidy. If you can't sell electric vehicles, sort of the marketplace is spoken, at least as it exists currently. The technology exists currently. I've been involved in all kinds of, you take electric vehicles, you plug them in, you use them as in a reverse generator perspective where it actually provides peak power load. I've seen all of these studies. All wildly expensive. The technology around it is yet to be developed in terms of being able to control grids. And just let me say one thing about the grid. Anytime I talk to anybody other than a power engineer and I try to explain why and how a grid works and how sensitive it is to time, place, location, type of generation, who uses it, what the load looks like, and how easy it is to break it, 3 seconds into that conversation, I get this glassy-eyed look, and I know I've lost them. So with them, it's sort of like the Dilbert cartoon. After you talk to an engineer, it's like, yes or no is all the answer I want. But by the nature of the grid, it's difficult to implement these kinds of things. Is there going to be a role for electric vehicles in the future? Yeah, probably. But again, what I tell people, this is the third generation of electric vehicles that have been tried, at least in the US, and all three of them, actually the fourth one, I mean, if you think about in the 1900s, that was the first form of motive transportation. It just has not done it because it's a simple thing. It's called range anxiety. And when somebody buys an electric vehicle and you think it's going to go 40 miles and you start to get all kind of nuts about it. And those are for the all plug-in. The mixed ones, I would have thought, to be blunt with you, I thought that had a chance of doing it. But again, the Volt facility in Hammerak or wherever the hell it is in Michigan, shut down because nobody is buying their cars. They got like a 120-day supply of those types of vehicles. So, yeah, I mean, I would like to think that it is, but the way I always go back to it is when the marketplace speaks, unless you can convince the market of something different, that's the results you're going to get.
I don't have a lot to say about it, except I'd like Larry to comment about his electrical vehicle that he owns. I would like to hear your experience with it, but we pre-wire all of our new homes to receive with plug-ins for the electrical vehicle. We're in Seattle. Seattle's very progressive. We have a lot of people that have short commutes. There's a really aggressive campaign to get quick charging stations all over the city. So I'm going to take the opposite point of view. I didn't know that they were all shut down with tons of inventory. I didn't know that. Thank you for that. But at any rate, I want to have an electrical vehicle someday. I'm holding out for when the range is 300 miles instead of 40 to 80 miles. But that's because I can't own 2 cars. I only want to own 1. So at any rate, I think that the electrical vehicles definitely have their place, and it's an urban setting, and also with our cheap electricity, and that may go up and change things, but the math on the electrical vehicle, I believe, is the equivalent of getting about 90 miles to the gallon.
I am a Nissan Leaf owner for just under a year, and every single Nissan Leaf that's been brought into the country has been sold. The new factory in Tennessee that will be creating cars, they're looking at 20,000 vehicles in the next year when they open. Most of those are spoken for. A lot of them are spoken for. In terms of range, it was a second car for us. And I commute about 25 miles round trip to go from Shoreline to Lake Washington Tech, or a mile or 2 to Shoreline, go to SeaTac, pick up my relatives, go up to Everett. However, with the West Coast Electric Highway being implemented as we speak, I can now drive from Shoreline up to Canada with quick chargers in Burlington, in Bellingham, and in Blaine. And south, there's a gap right now. I would have driven the Leaf here for this conference, but there's a gap right now between Seattle and Tumwater. But once you hit Tumwater, you can get down to the Oregon border and I-5 corridor completely through Oregon with quick charge stations. Having said that, I don't view the electric vehicle as being the long-distance car. Something like 95% of Americans commute less than 40 miles per day. And in terms of load management, when it is time to charge, I come home, it's spent 10 seconds to open the little hood and plug it in the evening, and in the morning it's fully charged. It takes about 10 seconds to unplug it, and I'm good to go for a few days. So I have absolutely the opposite one. I think that we will have electrified transportation sooner rather than later, largely because of cost. That the costs of the vehicles are down, and no maintenance, basically no maintenance, no fuel, no oil, no air filters, none of those things.
Well,
So,
thank you,
I'm
Larry.
very optimistic.
I obviously offered a somewhat provocative question here. I think we can probably continue during the break. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that my boss, the director of the Department of Commerce, commutes daily, or almost daily, from Seattle in a Leaf to Olympia. So there are some long-distance commuters. He may be one of the more long-distance Leaf commuters in the state. So with that, I would hope that you join me in thanking this really excellent panel and a wide variety of perspectives, and I think they'll stay around and be glad to talk with you individually. Thank you.